Good evening, everyone, and good morning to you, Stephanie. I welcome all the students, parents, alumni, recruiters, faculty of ILM University. Today we have with us Stephanie Brun de Pontet, who is a Ph.D. and is a principal consultant of the Family Business Consulting Group. She specializes in advising family enterprises facing important transitions. A recognized expert on continuity planning, Stephanie frequently collaborates with clients on key aspects of this process, such as establishing succession plans, drafting family charters, educating stakeholders, and developing needed governance structures. Her work is driven by knowledge and experience from the fields of management, entrepreneurship, and psychology. Today's topic is building the airplane while flying it, the need for alignment in times of uncertainty. Some of the topics which Stephanie will be talking about will be how the extreme disorientation we are all facing, making planning more difficult, how family businesses make good decisions when they are clear and aligned as a group on their values and purpose, the strength of family businesses, managing the paradox of honoring tradition and pioneering change, the value of enlisting the voices and ideas of the leading and rising generations in the family business. This session will be moderated by Professor Rahul Mishra, who is a professor of ILM University and professor of strategy. While I was going through some of Stephanie's work, something caught my eye, and that was how does the CEO using crisis to pivot to a better future? And she mentioned 5 points, which I wanted to highlight. Making employees a top priority, keep the organization lean and nimble, redefine what a responsible balance sheet looks like, adapt to consumer changing needs, step up to social responsibility. I think all these points are so very clear, that when we are working, how we can bring these changes into our system. And finally, I'm going to say, which we were talking about earlier on, is your life does not get better by chance. It gets better by change. When in doubt, choose change. So today I hand over to you, Stephanie, to take these discussions forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malvika. Appreciate that. And good evening, everybody. I'm honored to be invited to join you and hopefully share some useful ideas and thoughts, and I look forward to the conversation that Dr. Mishra will help us lead through. So I'm going to share my screen here. So again, as Malvika said, our topic is building the airplane while flying it, which is a construct that I think is helpful because it's often an analogy that I describe when I'm talking to entrepreneurial families, where you're moving very fast, but you don't yet have all the processes and structures in place. And that can be an unsettling experience, because you really have to be building the processes that you need, but you don't yet have them, and yet you can't stop the forward momentum. And I think in this time of tremendous uncertainty, we're all in a circumstance where we need to adapt to a fair amount of change. So even if we have an established business as opposed to a more entrepreneurial one, we need to be experiencing that kind of entrepreneurial energy of reinventing things kind of as we go along. But in order for that to work well, you really need alignment. And that can be a great strength of family businesses, is the ability for the family to be aligned and be on the same page. As Malvika pointed out, in this context, we are experiencing a lot of disorientation. So we'll touch on that. We'll talk about some of the challenges in business school, right? They talk about the art of making decisions and planning with imperfect information. We're really struggling with that these days. We'll talk about family businesses and how they plan, what are some of their strengths, this tradition and innovation balance. And hopefully, my hope is in these difficult days that we can land on a positive note that will launch us into some conversation, and look forward to everybody sharing maybe some questions in the chat that you might have. And I always like this image. I use this graphic of Charles Darwin sometimes when I'm working with families as they're navigating change, and really talking about, it's not about the strongest in the species that can survive, but those that can adapt. And we are in a period where the need to adapt has really almost never been so strong. So, you know, and I think one of the senses of disorientation that we have, I know when I walk around my neighborhood to take my dogs out for a walk and it's springtime and the sky is blue and the, you know, the leaves are coming out green, it seems like everything is right and normal in the world. But of course, at the same time, everything has changed. We need to be wearing masks. We're not able to do some of the things that we've normally done. You know, all the things that we sort of took for granted overnight went away, and that's very, very unsettling. And that is part of what's unsettling is the size and scale of the disruption. I mean, it is a massive disruption that we are experiencing collectively. It really did come out of the blue for many of us. You know, we just didn't anticipate it. So it feels like it came at us out of nowhere. So that's a sensation of feeling out of control, right? When something is happening to you, that is a very uncomfortable sensation and a very disorienting sensation. This is a change that is an actual threat to our physical well-being and our health. So that is a more unsettling kind of a change than, you know, just a general market change. I mean, we're experiencing a market change as well as an outgrowth of that, but it is the threat to our health and well-being, and the health and well-being of our loved ones, our elders, and the employees who might work for us. So all of that is, you know, creates anxiety. And we are all also experiencing a lot of losses. And so there's a grief process that it's useful for people to at least acknowledge. You know, I can point to a small example of grief. I mean, there are people who are experiencing real loss, family members who have become ill, et cetera. And so that is one level of very tangible and clear grief. But, you know, my daughter graduates from college this year. This Saturday was supposed to be her graduation ceremony. We will not have a graduation ceremony. And so, you know, that's a loss. It's a loss for her. It's a loss for me. So we are all being confronted by these kinds of losses, which again, influences our mindset, our emotions. And so that influences kind of where we are and what we're thinking about. And the other piece that I think is very significant is the uncertainty of the future. We don't know, you know, we were asking that this morning on the call before everybody joined, you know, what does the news say in the United States? Well, I mean, what it said yesterday versus what it says today, who knows, right? It's very, very hard to know how long this is going to last. Different experts have different opinions. And so we're all working with insufficient data, which makes it very difficult to plan. You know, how are we going to protect our people? We need to make a plan for that. But as we don't really know what the future looks like, how do you plan? You know, sometimes these require investments, right? We might need to create physical barriers in a work environment. We might think about what are the workflow rotations that are going to work. And so it's difficult to make decisions when you don't really have a lot of clarity on what the future might look like, you know, in 6 days, 6 weeks, or 6 months. Some businesses really need to ask themselves very difficult questions. What part of our business is still viable, right? There may be parts of our business or ways we've gone to market traditionally that may not work. And I think part of the grief process is recognizing that it's not going to go back to what it was in the past. I mean, I'm an optimistic person by nature. I feel confident that we will move to better days, and that business is going to be an engine of what helps us as a society, you know, build a greater success going forward. But in order for us to have that success, we need to build our capabilities of letting go of what is no longer viable. And so having some really hard conversations around that in family businesses, sometimes that's a challenge for them. They're very loyal. They have a lot of respect for the past and what worked for us in, previously, what our father or our grandfathers might have built. And so sometimes it can be very hard to acknowledge that something may no longer be viable. But it might be important to really have those kinds of conversations. So what do we need to stop? What needs to just be readjusted? There's a tweak or an innovation that can continue to make something viable, and what needs a total reinvention. And so that can be what kind of cutbacks we need to make. Are there some short-term pains that we need to take as a business that will allow us to continue to fight another day? Very, very difficult decisions to confront. That said, again, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? A crisis helps us to really focus. It will elevate what is really important. It will really give you clarity on what is essential. So I've seen a lot of my clients think about, how are we protecting our team members, right? We say that the people are the most important assets that we have. So how are we living that value? And that really unifies people. Okay, this is really important to us. And so this is where we're going to put time and energy to address that. What are the most essential aspects of our enterprise? And again, it pushes us to re-question how we've always gone to market. How have we always worked? In our firm, we're in the middle of doing that. We travel almost always to go see clients. Now we're needing to learn how to work with clients virtually. And sometimes, some things we might learn to continue to do virtually, even when we were able to travel again, because maybe that's more efficient. And so pushing ourselves to question our assumptions, again, a crisis creates an opportunity to do that as things are moving along in normal times, we get comfortable. And so we don't question or reevaluate things, which might sometimes make us be less creative. And on that lines, I think, this does increase the appetite for risk, because as nothing really works as it should, all of a sudden risks or trying new things feels less risky, because the old ways don't work anyways. So we kind of have no choice. We need to innovate. And so there's a greater willingness to try new things, which can create, some nice opportunities for business that if we can be comfortable with change, will be an asset for the business and the enterprise. I think one of the challenges around this comfort with the uncertainty, it is helpful to try to think about what's under your control and what's not under your control, right? I try to stay educated about what's happening, listen to the scientists, and try to understand the reality. But the truth is, it's not under my control when the pandemic is going to end, or even when my local state is going to reopen. And so I don't really have much control over that. And so, maybe under my control, if I would feel like that is giving me a lot of anxiety, perhaps less news, right? Or try to dose out the amount of news that you expose yourself to if it's causing you too much stress. Certainly, you can engage in good practices of social distancing, and think about how your own ability to manage what's under your control and what's not under your control. And there are differences in terms of people's comfort with that. If you have an internal locus of control, instinctively as a person, you feel like you have more mastery and more control of your future. Some folks have a more external locus of control. They feel like things happen to them. So to the extent that you can try to focus your thinking on what are the things that you can control, that will give you an increased sense of mastery. And that can be helpful in terms of, again, reducing one's sense of anxiety and being able to focus our attention on the things which I can do something about, right? So getting your stakeholders aligned on the priorities, that's something that is to some degree under your control. Increasing your thinking around innovation, bringing people, maybe a cross-generation of family members to the table to have a conversation, that's an opportunity, that's something that you can do. Developing a very clear message that you're consistently communicating with all of your stakeholders so people understand where you're coming from, and they want to see that their leaders have a plan. And so being able to be clear on what the plan is, even if the plan is, look, this is what we're doing for the next 3 weeks and we are reevaluating, we can't promise you what it's going to look like in 6 months, but here are the steps we are taking. Here's the reasoning and the thinking behind it. And of course, addressing safety measures that you can put in place at the place of work. These are things that are, under your control and can be helpful to focus some attention on. I would suggest, and obviously I'm very biased, I work in this area, but family businesses, I think, have tremendous strengths. And I would say that businesses today, through this pandemic, family businesses have a lot of resilience that is going to help them get through it. First, this strong sense of connection to their people. So there is a sense of family-ness that extends well beyond the actual biological family, but that people feel that they are part of the family, and that sense of being connected to something bigger than just yourself strengthens that sense of teamwork. And today we need to be a team and work together to figure out solutions and ideas, and you want that perspective of your team members and their commitment to moving forward with you. And so I think that's a real strength. And I think showing that your commitment to the people in terms of protecting them, et cetera, that's that two-way street that I think family businesses are typically quite good at. This long-term view, right? This too shall pass. Again, we're not going back to what we had 3 months ago, but there is a future, and there is a future that your business can confront and can be successful in. And so that ability to not just be worried about next quarter's results will allow people to kind of get through the retrenchment that is most likely necessary in the near term. I think the depth of experience and strong contacts, a lot of family business get very involved in their respective industries. They know people, they have relationships. A lot of family businesses work with other family businesses, right? That their suppliers are family businesses or their customers are family businesses. And so that network of relationships and connections and that experience that might have come in a couple of generations that people have been working in an industry gives, again, a strength from which to operate through these challenging times. This piece of alignment, the ability to get all of your shareholders or owners around a table, around the kitchen table maybe, and just make those hard decisions. It's much more efficient than trying to go through a series of different kind of committees, et cetera. And so that's a great opportunity. And that might involve making difficult decisions like choosing to tighten your belt, right? The example in the previous recession that we would point to sometimes in the automotive space in the United States in the Great Recession, a lot of the automotive businesses really struggled. The Ford Motor Company, which is still a family business, now it's a publicly traded company, but the family owns about 30% of the voting shares. They own maybe 4% of the shares. So it's an interesting hybrid, but they still have an important amount of influence. And they looked into the future and they saw that the financial clouds were not very positive. And so they chose to stop taking a dividend, to keep cash in the business, to strengthen the business. And as a result, the Ford Motor Company was the only one of the car companies in the United States that didn't need to get bailed out by the government, because the owners, were able to get aligned and make a decision about how they were going to manage their capital that allowed them to weather that previous storm. So that's an example, again, of how, having an aligned and committed ownership group that's maybe willing to make some shared sacrifices can help a business survive, again, for the long term because of that long-term view. And another piece, again, that I see in most of my clients is that they tend to be less leveraged. I was, again, had a meeting with a client that's in the commercial real estate space this week, and they've always maintained a relatively low loan to value percentage. And so even if they see their rents are going to go down in the near term, they are not in so much debt to the bank that they can't weather that. And so that ability will give them the resilience to get through these difficult days. And again, time and again, we've seen family businesses typically have that mindset of being less leveraged, which is really helpful. So I think those are some important strengths to point out on the family business side. I think other useful thing to be aware of is, how do family businesses plan, right? And so they, again, well-run, long-lasting family businesses typically are well aligned as to their core values and their purpose. What are the foundational principles that create this sense of true north for them, and that often differentiate them in the marketplace? So, values help you when you need to make hard decisions, right? If you're clear on what are the non-negotiables, then hard decisions become a little bit easier to make. And again, everybody is in agreement as to what those values are, and what the purpose is. Then you can address the changes that are happening in the marketplace from a position of clarity, which is really important, and will allow people to make decisions more quickly. And as, again, the circumstances are changing very fast, speed of decision is important in this context. And again, when people are aligned as to what the purpose of the business is, why do we get up every day and come to work and work hard, that is helpful. And I would say that at every generation, a family business, the stakeholders in that family need to get aligned as to what is their why. Why do we want to be business partners? Why are we the best possible owners for this business? And it is fair and reasonable at this time to ask that question again. So even if you've asked it before, the world has changed pretty dramatically. And so do we still want to be the owners of this business? Do we have what it takes to make the hard choices, and any needed kind of profound pivots to adjust our model? Again, I think this is just a helpful illustration of how kind of values and purpose influence our big picture thinking, right? So if we think about the values as the guiding principles, the example of the Disney, right? That their values of imagination and wholesomeness, those were core to how that whole business model got developed. And so that defines, normally the strategic direction of the business is anchored by the core purpose, the core values and the purpose. Today, in this model, what I sort of change the strategic long-term direction is really, can you get aligned as a stakeholder group on what's the vivid description of the immediate business imperative? What does your business need to do now to be able to pivot and survive, to be able to thrive in the future? And so, again, companies that are very clear on their values, that helps them think about what's really important to us. What kind of business do we want to be? And again, as families, it's tied to our sense of identity. It's tied to our family's history, our narrative, our self-perception. And so particularly important, and I think families have a strong sense of values, and they're very authentic. It's not sort of words on a poster, right? They really reflect the beliefs of a family. And so I think they can be deeper held, and are then a great resource and a strength for the system. And similarly, a purpose, right, is again, that it clarifies why we're in business. It's not the current product lines or the customer segments, right? Sometimes people get confused on that. It's really a much more idealistic statement of what's the difference you're trying to make in the world. What is the impact, the something that's bigger than ourselves that really motivates a team to say, we are accomplishing something because we're doing something, right? So Disney's core purpose to make people happy, right? It's not about, making movies or theme parks or cartoons or any of the rest of it. It's about making people happy. And so if the business model changes, right? If, let's say, theme parks are no longer possible, right? People live in a future pandemic world, but then the company's question is not, our business model is no longer valid. Our business model needs to pivot because there's other ways that we can make people happy. What are the core competencies and skills and capabilities that we bring to the table in order for us to meet our mission in life of trying to make people happy? And so maybe we have to redefine what we do it, how we do it. But if we're clear on, and we're aligned, right, and our stakeholders all are motivated by that purpose, then we can make the adjustments together to reinvent and reimagine a future where we can continue to make people happy, or whatever it is that your purpose statement is, even if the underlying kind of business model that you're operating under is under tremendous threat and might need to be substantially reinvented. I think another strength of family businesses, and Malvika pointed to it, is this capacity for family businesses to manage a lot of paradox, a lot of both and one of the big ones is tradition and innovation, right? This ability to really have a deep respect for, again, what are those core values? What is it that we've always learned? We learned in our family systems that defines who we are as people, that we truly value and are really important and core to us. It's how we've always done things, and having the flexibility and the willingness to do things, right? To really mix things up and to be pioneers and to be future oriented. And again, that ability to think long term, I think, is part of what family businesses then have the ability to take big innovative leaps, because they can make investments that don't have a payoff for another 3, 4, 5 years. A publicly traded business cannot do that. Their board won't let them. So family businesses have this ability to both have a clear understanding of their past and be anchored by that, and have that, really be resonant in their DNA, and then thinking about how do we leverage that and be clear on what our purpose statement is, but be flexible enough to reinvent it. But sometimes people struggle with that, right? I mean, because we can overlean on the tradition side, and then sometimes you have the younger generation that's overleaning on the change side. And so that can sometimes create a little bit of tension in the family, but I think of it as a healthy tension, because you really, again, like a lot of paradoxes, you need both. It's really not an either or proposition. So thinking about how do you lean into those strengths that you would, bring to the table. And just as a case example, this is a business case that is often cited as the Beretta family business. And they've done a tremendous job of balancing stability. They've been in the same tiny village in Italy, I think since like the 1500s. I mean, they've been around, since 1526, 15 generations of being a family business, and people in that community from one generation to the next. So it's not just the owning family, but the families of that area have worked for that business for centuries. And there are artisans who have worked, and they have a craft. And so it's artist training from like an apprenticeship from one generation to the next, learning the craft and the handcrafted pieces of the artistry that comes into some of the products that they make. And at the same time, they have the most state-of-the-art factory with robots, spotless, super, super high-tech precision manufacturing. So they do both. And so the ability to bring both of those influences to the table is a great strength of family businesses. And so I just kind of point to that, example that you might see, you might find the business case on that if you're interested in learning more about it. And then a more recent story that one of my colleagues interviewed, this family in the United States, the Lopes family. It's a 4th generation family-owned business. They supply produce and dairy to restaurants and institutions. And when this pandemic hit, they realized that, schools were being closed, restaurants were being shut down. So their entire customer base was basically evaporating. And they decided that they needed to pivot and reinvent themselves. And so they completely changed, really in the course of like a week or so. They, in order to be able to keep their people employed, right? They were starting to have to lay off their truck drivers, et cetera. And they thought, nope, there's a demand. They were paying attention to what's happening in the market. People were looking for fresh produce. People were cooking more at home because they're not going out to restaurants. And so they thought, okay, we just need this is a new supply chain for us, right? We've never delivered things to residential homes. It's a very different model, but they went through very quickly. Again, a family business can make decisions like that and pivot their business model very fast, very efficient, that a large, publicly traded company doesn't have that nimbleness. So again, I think this is a great illustration of that flexibility of family businesses. But on a scale, that's maybe a little bit smaller than the Beretta, but I just thought it's a great story of that kind of innovation in this very specific crisis of today. So, we are going to need new ideas. As I said earlier, the future will be different than the past, and we're not going back. We are facing a reality that is permanently changed. We don't yet know what that future looks like, but I think we can say with confidence that new ways of thinking and working will be needed. And so, the skills that you can bring to the table around open-minded thinking, innovation, being nimble is something you really are going to want to be able to lean into. And I think the experience of the leading generation that has weathered previous storms, whether it be the past recession or other disruptions in your industry or your business, very valuable to tap into that wisdom and that battle testedness, I guess, right? Because sometimes the younger generation, we've had a period of uninterrupted growth for so long that it's a shock to the system to think, oh my gosh, things don't always grow and don't always go perfectly. So really leaning into that experience of people who have been through storms before, equally leaning into the energy and the ideas of the rising generation and the new ways of thinking, whether it be technology or even, again, just a fresh perspective. Maybe you have a family member who's not working in your business and has other experience, but might think of things, might ask questions that people who are in the business and so focused on how we've always done it, not because they aren't open-minded, but because that's just what you do every day, that it's helpful sometimes to bring in the perspective of somebody who just might bring you a question that you hadn't thought about, or help you question the assumptions. It's very hard, right? It's like a fish in a fishbowl doesn't realize that they're in water. Like, so sometimes we're not aware of the assumptions that we make day in and day out, just because that's kind of how we breathe. So we need to understand a little bit of kind of what's at stake. Leaders in a crisis, they must do a lot of things. They need to sort of really take stock of the situation, what's happening. They need to protect and support the team. They need to provide clarity and guidance, even in this uncertain and lack of clarity world. They need to be the voice of clarity of what they are doing, provide confidence to people that the leaders know where they're going, bringing that wisdom and perspective of their experience from many, many years being involved in the business. Be willing to share in the sacrifices. A lot of families are, I've seen many client families where the family members aren't taking a salary, or they've cut their salary back significantly, to share in the struggle that their people are experiencing, and be open to input into new ideas. And the younger generation should also be involved in some of these things, right? They can bring an understanding of the perspective on the future, right? So they can help figure out the situation by bringing a new set of ways of thinking about things. They also can be involved in protecting and supporting the team, sharing in the sacrifice. But, I think to the extent that the family is aligned on that, that shows a lot of solidarity and commitment. And that speaks volumes to team members when they see, that the whole family is willing to really stand aside and pay attention to these things. And again, provide clarity and guidance. The younger generation sometimes has more perspective on how do we leverage technology. They bring the perspective of being closer to certain kinds of markets, maybe that the current generation is maybe less familiar with. And again, being open to the ideas of the senior generation, as well as being open and willing to share their ideas and their experience and perspective. So in closing, I thought I would just share a few questions, right, that you might want to consider with your families. I think of these as kind of like discussion questions, right? So what are the family values and business philosophy that have been key to our success over the years? Really sitting down and thinking about that and trying to write those down. Like, how would you describe them? What are some of the words, whether it be that a grandparent would have shared, et cetera? How do we, because sometimes we know these things, but we've never really put them to paper. So we might not all be sharing the same vocabulary. So it can be a worthwhile exercise to help the family. Again, that's a start of alignment. Can we get aligned as to what those words are? How is the current disruption affecting our business industry today? Again, really trying to think through that. What's likely to be the impact in 3 months, in 2 years, in 10 years? Try to think outside of the box and really commit yourself to not trying to think about it's going to be back to what it used to be. Really push yourself to think about a future, a different state. And given those 2 points above, right, what needs to change in how we operate? Even if that's uncomfortable, even if that means we need to make some really difficult decisions, because sometimes the sooner you make some difficult decisions, the more they generate a positive impact. If you wait too long to make a hard cut or a hard decision, you may create more self-inflicted pain, so that adjustment, you know, it's just like the lockdowns and the pandemics, right? I mean, sometimes if people try to step away from these shared sacrifices that we're making now too quickly, it could come back and create more problems down the road. So I think it's the same thing here. What are some difficult decisions that we need to make, and how quickly can we make them? And then what are the core competencies in our business and family that could be leveraged, right? What really brings, what do we bring to market that has allowed us to be successful, that we can bring to bear in this, you know, so again, back to the Disney model, right? How do we make people happy? If we used to make people happy this way, if we can't make people happy that way anymore, what are some other competencies and gifts that we can bring that will allow us to continue to be successful with our purpose, even if it's in a newly defined way as a business? So that brings me, I think, to the end of my presentation, and look forward to engaging in the question. I like this little cartoon, of course, because change is hard, and we do a lot of change. We accompany a lot of families on the journey of change. This level of change is really quite severe, but humans resist change, right? So I want you to build an innovative way to do exactly the same way it's been done for 25 years. We need to get away from that thinking in order to move forward. So I will stop sharing now and return us to the discussion.
So thank you, Stephanie. It was a very great presentation, and I have learned a lot, and I think there are students and faculty members who would be feeling the same. So let me start my first question. I think, and I also tell you the background that I teach family business at ILM, and we have a deep commitment to teaching family business and entrepreneurship, and a lot of our students come from that background. Mm-hmm. I would like to draw your attention to one of the important issues of alignment in family business, that is role of professionals in family business, mm-hmm. particularly in India. And I will give you two examples. So one example is there's a big FMCG company called Dabur, where the owners, the Burman family, and there's a fourth generation family in business, they have moved out from the day-to-day management activities, and they have and has allowed professionals to take over. So this is one example, and they have done pretty well, you know, financially, business-wise, expanded into many other areas. In fact, if you are part of the Burman family and if you want to do business, then you have to take out money and go into some different, you know, set up your different organization or different company. You can't do business in Dabur on that. Okay. And then there are other examples where the professionals have been allowed to take over the day-to-day activities, but they haven't done very well. So what is your take, you know, given the scenario with the consulting and other background, what is your take? And also the context is that in the very uncertain times, you also need a lot of professional advice outside your family. So the role of professional managers and advice from outside family, the professionals who know much more than the family members. So I think that's the question.
No, it's a great question, and I think families struggle with that. It's another one of those paradoxes. I think families that are successful with this, sometimes families the pendulum will swing, right? At the beginning, it's all family all the time, right? And so it's a family business. The business is in the service of the family, and we just do things for the family. And then whoops, we can overcorrect because maybe family members weren't as successful and we feel like the business has outgrown the competencies of the family. And then it's, no, we don't want to have any family at all. That family is bad. It's going to all be professional management. And then, then you have shareholders or stakeholders who are not as invested, they are not paying attention, or then you lose that patient capital possibly, and people are only thinking about what's their dividend. And so I think the optimal path is finding a both and, right? So being clear that when we're selecting people for roles in the business, that we try to bring as much objectivity and business criterion to that as we possibly can. And that might mean that not everybody in the family can play a role in the business. And frankly, maybe not everybody in the family should play a role in the business. I see a lot of times with families where I describe it as the gravitational pull. And this is particularly a factor, I think, in larger businesses, where truly the gravitational pull of the business is very profound. And young family members will say to me, you know, Stephanie, I know my parents say I don't need to work in the business and I can find my own path. But all my friends think I would be crazy not to work in the business. So, you know, you might find a lot of social pressure that is saying to you, well, your family owns such and such a business. What do you mean you don't work there? What's wrong with you? But in truth, if your calling is to be a teacher or your calling is to be a musician or something else, you know, I think it's tragic actually when family members work in the business and that's not really well aligned with their interests and their passions, because at a certain point then the vision of the future, they're still carrying their parents' vision as opposed to what they really want for themselves. So the opportunity, I think, is to help family members develop skills and competence as owners so you can still be engaged and add value that way. And for family members who want to work in the business and we develop skills. And for a lot of family businesses, it's a huge asset to have operating family members working in the business, right? And you would lose something if you didn't have that, especially as I was touching on before, there's entire industries where most businesses are family businesses and there's family relationships, right? Between the business partnerships, et cetera. And so being able to call one of the owners for a business transaction means something. So to the extent that that there are family members who have an interest and that interest can be nurtured and we can give them skills, but then we have to help hold them accountable so that they develop to their potential and they can truly add value as managers. And so I think, you know, you're raising a topic that we could have, you know, a 3-day symposium just on that. It's a very rich topic. But I think the same thing goes for advisors, right? So I do a lot of governance work with families and helping them put together a board with independent advisors or independent directors. And yeah, my bias is in favor of having, you know, for most businesses to have a majority of independent advisors on the board, but I also want family directors on the board. And I want family directors who've been trained and we've helped them develop competence so that they understand what it means to be a director and that they can work in close collaboration with those independent advisors and not just be, I've seen sometimes with family businesses where you have like a second tier board, right? There's the real board, that's the independent board, and the family directors are just, you know, they're kind of there to warm the seat. That is, you're missing an opportunity because the family brings a perspective and a voice and a connection to the values and the history that is very important for the independent advisors to truly understand and to not minimize that, right? Maybe that family member doesn't have the same pedigree or have all the sort of experience that the directors have, but that's a critical component. That's an important voice to have at that board level in order for the family business to really be able to leverage all the strengths of being a family business.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I have got, 2-3 questions more, but let me open it for the audience and then I will come back again.
Sure.
I'll allow any faculty member or any student to explain.
Yes, sir, I have a question for ma'am.
Yes.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
This is Professor Pampush. Ma'am, I have a question. So we all understand that communication remains the key for any business, and family businesses are no exception to this. And in these times of uncertainty, when there's such a lot of crisis all around us, do you think there's any ideal communication strategy for family businesses?
I mean, I think I would err on the side of more communication. So I've been encouraging a number of my clients and been trying to facilitate, as a matter of fact, you know, shareholder updates, right? Most of my client families, you know, there are several family members who might work in the business, but there are several family members who don't work in the business. And I think it's important to communicate. I think as it relates to your team, you know, you probably want to be communicating to them in the business on a daily basis. You know, maybe there's a morning huddle, kind of like, here's the update, here's what we're doing. And then
Right.
At the next level, you know, kind of on a weekly. But I think with the broader family, I would encourage families to be in touch with their stakeholders at least once a month, if not more often. And I think you also want to communicate with other key partners, right? You might want to make sure you're communicating to your bank, you know, your suppliers. So there's a lot of different stakeholders in the system that the more you can be up front of the communication. You want to be ahead of it as opposed to behind it. You know, you want to be responding to things. If you're proactive and you're answering questions before it's even been asked, that will give people a lot of confidence.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Stephanie, I think Professor Ritu from IILM University, Gurugram, wants to ask a question. Ritu?
Okay.
Yeah, good evening, Stephanie. So there is, so we were speaking about communication, and then there is the other aspect of people handling and people management. So in times like these, showing concern and empathy for others, at the same time taking hard decisions are two very different objectives.
Yep.
How do you prioritize or balance one or both? Because
No,
times
no.
are not easy.
They are not easy. And that's the thing. I mean, how do you show care when you need to make a decision that involves laying people off, right? I mean, and so that does not feel like a lot of care. I think, you know, the example of the client that I was talking about before that's in the commercial real estate, when we were doing their shareholder update, they were talking about, I think they had out of 700 tenants or something, they had almost 300 that were delinquent on their rental payments, right, for the past month. And so they've been proactively reaching out to them to work with them to figure out, okay, what's a rent abatement that we can offer you, because you know, they need to think about how do we help these partners of ours, right? The tenants that are really the business. We have these commercial real estate centers, and these people pay us rent, and that's how we make money. But those businesses are really struggling, and so how do you work with them in partnership, but also not say, okay, we're just going to forgive all of the rent. That may not be possible for them. So trying to find a balance, and I think good communication really helps. And I think if, you know, again, that's one of the strengths of family businesses is that well-run family businesses, I think of them as more humanistic, right? They care about their people. They have sort of, again, the family's name is attached to the business. And so maybe that influences how they think about things, maybe less just transactionally. And so there's more trust there. And so people understand that they have your best interest at heart. And it's the same thing with if you have to let go of people on your team, right? That your team members understand that even though you may have to let them go now, you're going to do everything in your power to strengthen and build the business because you're looking to rehire them. You're looking to bring them back on. And so I think if the family has a strong reputation of being caring people who have always been thoughtful about the well-being of whether it be their business partners or their employees, that will help navigate some of those difficult conversations. And again, it comes from an authentic place.
That's quite interesting, Stephanie. We have a question coming in from Dr. Abha Singh from our campus at Greater Noida. Dr. Abha?
She mute or?
I think I'm not able to. Yeah. Can I come?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Good evening, Stephanie, and it was a really great learning today for me. I have a question that how do you build emotional resilience in the organization? That is one. And second, how organization can transform from system of efficiency to system of resilience in the pandemic?
That's a great question. How do you go from efficiency to resilience? Again, I think that flexibility, right? We were talking about that before the group joined, about the ability to think, to be resilient is to be very flexible in our thinking, and efficiency sometimes is about process and structure, which allows us to be efficient, and you need that in a business. I think we need to be able to question, right, what are the processes of efficiency that continue to work for us, and then what are ones that we need to adjust, right? I mean, even thinking about how workflow operates, things are being optimized might involve people standing very close to one another. And so we need to separate people. And so that will be less efficient. But from the perspective of needing to protect the safety of our employees, we need to adjust that. And then the opportunity is, how might we continue to increase our efficiency in this new way of operating, right? We had this way of working that created efficiencies that's been taken away from us. So we need to reinvent how we work, yet we still want to be efficient. And so that's an opportunity to think about, how do we keep inventing, right? Invest in our R&D and develop new ways. And I think businesses that are going to be successful are the ones who will be able to bring those kinds of innovations that in this new model will figure out ways to bring different kinds of efficiencies. But I think that's going to be a challenge. And you had a first question.
How to build emotional resilience in the organization. So
yeah, well, and you know, I think emotional resilience, part of it is temperament, right? So some folks just more naturally have emotional resilience, but I think to the extent that you can speak to it, right, and give people permission to express their emotions, and help them name a little bit what they're going through. So that's, I find it's helpful sometimes for people to recognize, for example, that I talked about earlier about this notion of grief and loss. And I think if we can help people name what they're feeling, and help normalize it for them to say, you know, we're all experiencing these kinds of things that are causing some distress, then that helps people recognize that they can acknowledge those feelings about that they're experiencing, and that doesn't just sort of cloud their judgment. I think sometimes people are afraid of emotionality and they try to sort of run away from it, but then it ends up causing them more harm, especially because then they don't even see it. they're trying to deny that it's there, and then it's more blinding in a sense, because you're not aware of how is this influencing my thinking, because I just wanted to go, no, you know, it's not happening. And so I think helping people be a little bit more aware of the emotional load that this experience is generating for everybody will probably be helpful in increasing that emotional resilience and emotional intelligence.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Very interesting. You know, emotional resilience continues to be something that needs to be strengthened. We have a student who's doing undergraduate business management program. Uzair wants to ask you a question. Uzair?
Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone. Actually, my question is, if succession is a big issue in family business in India, according to you, who should be preferred as a successor? One who is a pilot, who can navigate the plane, or well, one who keeps up the building of the plane while hires the pilots for flying it?
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think at this time, you know, we probably need teams of leaders, because in a sense, you kind of need those different skills and the ability to collaborate. Oftentimes in families, you know, you have folks who have different types of skills that bring to the table, right? The classic one is somebody who's really good with the outward facing stuff. They're good at business development. They build a lot of relationships, but they're not really structured, or they're not good at building the processes. And there's somebody else that's really good at building the processes. You know, you need both of those skills. You kind of can't have a business, especially as the business is growing. Oftentimes at the entrepreneurial stage, there's not a lot of processes because the entrepreneur is just kind of doing things and having success that way. But as the company grows, all of a sudden you need a little bit more structure. You need some people who are able to build the plane and put those processes in place, because otherwise it just becomes chaotic. But if you only have somebody who is sort of structured and is unable to maintain the relationships and do some of that outward business development facing stuff, you know, the plane won't go anywhere. So you need both. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I do think that that you need a blend of those skills. And depending on, you know, the circumstance, right? You know, we think about the different leaders in the United States that we have, that you're sort of seeing in the news. the leader in the state of New York, who's very, he's very direct. He's sort of saying, here's what's happening, here's what I'm doing. He's kind of take no prisoners, but it's very clear that, he's in charge. I think he creates some confidence, but he probably isn't a leadership style that everybody is super happy with. But through this crisis, that is a very reassuring kind of model. But is that sustainable long term? That's an interesting question, right? So do you need one kind of leadership style just to get through the crisis, and then you might need to pivot to a different leadership style once we get to the other side? So that's another thought.
In fact, that's very interesting to hear, Stephanie, because just to align, since the COVID crisis started at ILM as a process, there have been cross-functional teams which are working on certain key projects, and these teams are from across the campuses. So very interestingly, the teams are getting together on various projects. They are learning to cooperate, and a lot of them have not even met, at some point of time. But interesting to hear. That's what you are also suggesting, So there are different teams.
And that's, that'll be, again, sometimes the other piece that we need to focus on in this crisis, sometimes just to help us feel less sad, but there are some silver linings, right? Like you're describing. So sometimes we are being pushed to innovate and try new things, and hopefully those cross-disciplinary teams that have been stood up to meet this particular situation, will create maybe future research opportunities. People will have learned to collaborate together, and all of a sudden, we have an interest in something else, and something that has nothing to do with the pandemic, but will emerge organically out of this sort of forced experience. And I think that's that piece of innovation. Again, even in our firm, we're creating new product and service offerings that we would have never done, but we're in this circumstance, and we're just, we're reinventing, and we're also kind of getting out there. And again, normally I think we would have crafted something more, we would have tested it, we would have questioned ourselves. Now we're just saying, you know what, we got to get this out there because our clients need us to help them in this way. And it's maybe not perfect, but we're going to go out and we're going to work with clients this way, and then we're going to learn from that, and then we'll improve it. And, so that's pushing us to be a little bit more entrepreneurial as well.
Absolutely. A lot of collaboration and collaborative styles are emerging, and small observations of little leadership styles are also emerging, where small groups are coming together and you see different people trying to take the objectives to a conclusion. Okay, we have another question from Dr. Vidisha Banerjee from our Lodi Road campus. So incidentally, all these campuses are coming from different locations, which are geographically right now in different states. So Dr. Vidisha, please.
So governments all around the world are starting the stimulus packages, and in India especially, the government has focused a lot on the small and medium industries. In such a scenario where the governments are willing to give stimulus packages, what are some of the strategies that small businesses, family-owned businesses can have to take the maximum advantage of this situation? Because this is almost like a boon coming in the middle of adversity, and there is definitely something that the businesses can do to maximize their strengths and also rebuild on the things that they were lagging behind.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. I think we're seeing that in the US as well, where there's, again, a lot of capital being thrown into the system, which has, a lot of it has gone to small businesses to help them, continue to pay their people. So I think that the intent, at least in the US, has been to try to maintain employment of people, because they're afraid that there would be so much unemployment otherwise, even more than we already have. But I do think, it creates, if you can have good alignment around what does the future look like, can we take this capital to retool, right? Do we need to invest in new technology or equipment, or explore a new way of going to market? So how can we take this capital and use it to bring some of the innovations that we were talking about, that the business needs to question? But again, I would say that the instinct might be to kind of go back to our comfort zone and say, you know, we want to put this into what we've always done. So how can we try to think about this seed money, right, as a gift, and it's sort of like an R&D. It's an experimental fund that we can use to try and retool. Because again, I do think that there's lots of opportunities for businesses who are going to be able to meet the new needs. But I think so. So in a sense, taking this risk capital that's been kind of given as a gift and using that to try innovative things makes those new efforts less risky, because it's not like you needed to put capital out of your own pocket into that effort. So hopefully it'll stimulate more ideas and more innovations.
Aishman, can I come with a question? Probably the last question. Can I ask the last question from Stephanie?
Absolutely, please.
Okay. So Stephanie, going back to your presentation, you have talked about twin challenges of stability and innovation. So how do you introduce innovation when there are different generations working together and there are conflicting views? And we also see that if you look at the top innovative firms, we hardly see any family businesses appearing in that. All these firms are very meritocratic, very, very new. And so how do you, how do you address this question on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think there's an opportunity to blend. I think family businesses, in a sense, are sometimes less innovative because they're more conservative in style, right? So they're not going to take a lot of debt to go in some kind of a new direction. But I think that if they're clear on their purpose, they can be innovative. I think of a family that had to really reinvent their entire business model because they were in the media space, right? And so as that's been really disrupted by the internet and technology, so they had newspapers and televisions and radio stations, and it was a very core part of their identity. And, when you're in the news business, you feel like you're part of democracy, right? You're sharing information with the people. And so it was very difficult. And they probably couldn't have done it a generation ago, but they were able to sell their radio and television assets. And then the last set of assets that they sold were the newspapers. And those, again, I mean, more than 100 years, this family has been in that business. And so for them to be able to step away from that, and they were reinvesting their capital then that they were getting into cloud-based services, right? So what they thought about is, our purpose is communicating, keeping communities connected to one another, right? And so because they had newspapers in relatively smaller markets or communities. And so they thought, okay, the technology has changed. The way we've done this, we just keep losing money. But they were very deliberate and thoughtful about it. And so the leader did a very good job of reaching out to all the stakeholders. And, could they have sold their newspapers more quickly for more money? Probably. But they took the time to make sure that everybody was comfortable with the decision. And they also had a vision for what the future could look like. We're going to put money into these types of businesses. We are still keeping communities connected to one another, but just through different platforms, right? Through cloud services, through internet providers, et cetera. And we are still focused in those smaller underserved markets. And so they thought about, how do we continue to help democracy by keeping these communities connected, but innovate and change the way we go to market, because our business model is just not viable, the previous one that we had for so long. And so there was the balance of patience and getting everybody on the same page about what the future could look like. How do we still feel connected to this? And it wasn't smooth or easy, right? I mean, I think people, some of the shareholders, there were tears that were shed when they made these decisions, but they made the decisions together. They got their board aligned. So they really did the leader did a tremendous job of, really communicating to all the stakeholders so that they could make this difficult decision. And everybody felt like they had a voice in the process, even though it was very clear what the decision was going to be. The decision was a very smart business decision, but they took the time to get people aligned so that it didn't create a massive disruption or rupture in the family. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Stephanie, thank you. I think it's been an extremely enriching session, and you've touched upon a lot of dimensions, dimension of change, dimension of a choice, what to let go and what to keep. And we focused on strengths, we focused on weaknesses, and especially important is what kind of strength do we focus on, which is going to be really of help in the future, especially in a post-COVID world.
Yep.
So on behalf of the entire audience and the students, the faculty members, some parents who were there, and on behalf of ILM and ILM management, Stephanie, we thank you so much for all the insights you've given and for all your time. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and taking a lot more of your insights.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the opportunity, and best of luck. Please, everybody, stay healthy and stay well, and good luck out there innovating and bringing new ideas.
Yeah, pleasure, and thank you. Stay healthy and stay well.